From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Laura Hutchinson. Last week, the United States Supreme Court handed down decisions that could affect your civil rights. The court ruled that Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional because it violated the right to liberty and equal protection for gay married couples. The court also nullified Sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both sections related to states having to receive permission from the Justice Department or a federal court before making changes to any voting procedures. We're going to talk about these rulings and what these rulings mean for us in just a minute. But first, here's NBC's Steve Handelsman to explain the details of the gay marriage ruling.
The California couples who won were beaming at the high court decision and emotional.
It's the day I finally get to look at the man that I love and finally say, will you please marry me?
Same-sex marriage is legal again in California. The Prop 8 ban is unconstitutional. The justices, by 5-4, let that ruling by a lower court stand, but did not address marriage rights in that or other states. Still a win for Chris Perry and Sandy Steer.
Now we will be married and we will be equal to every other family in California.
Every same-sex married couple benefits from the court's other ruling, the Defense of Marriage Act. Blocking federal marriage benefits to same-sex spouses is unconstitutional. For the 5-4 majority, Justice Kennedy said DOMA demeans the couple whose moral and sexual choices the Constitution protects. And it humiliates tens of thousands of children now being raised by same-sex couples. 84-year-old Edie Windsor is the one who sued. When her spouse, Thea, died, Edie was forced to pay federal taxes on inheritance, as if they weren't married. Now, Edie gets a refund and a place in history.
It makes me feel incredibly proud, incredibly proud and humble.
Back at the court, conservatives and evangelicals were upset.
A radical attempt to redefine marriage.
The Supreme Court has no authority when it comes to the nature of marriage. That authority belongs to the Creator.
Nearby, the California couples got a call.
The president's on the line.
Barack Obama, who'd left on Air Force One.
We're proud of you guys for your courage. You're moving out a whole lot of people everywhere.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And the ruling sparked celebrations from California to Texas. I'm Steve Handelsman, NBC News at the U.S. Supreme Court.
And joining us now to discuss the ruling, we have Jennifer Levi, an attorney with GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. I want to thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, this ruling definitely considered a landmark win for the gay rights movement. However, very controversial, as we just saw in that story. Not everybody is on the same page with this. So first of all, I want to ask you from a legal standpoint, did you see this happening?
Well, yes, in truth. A law that the federal government passed to exclude and demean same-sex couples and only same-sex couples can only be justified by animus, by bias, and that's impermissible. And so, you know, it's always difficult to predict outcomes and easier after the fact, but I have to say that those of us who worked on this case were very hopeful about this outcome.
Okay, and you have worked on a number of cases. Talk to us about some of the cases you worked on here in Massachusetts.
Sure, I worked on the case on behalf of a number of Massachusetts couples who were seeking the right to marry here, and the outcome in that case was that Massachusetts became the first state to allow same-sex couples to marry. Those marriages started in 2004. I also worked on a similar case in Connecticut that also led to marriage equality in that state.
So talk to us about what this ruling means for us here in Massachusetts, in other states. Sometimes people will get married here and move to other states. So talk to me about how this now affects everyone.
Sure. So as the court said, there are over 1,000 federal laws that relate to how the federal government is going to treat married couples. Married same-sex couples had been entirely excluded from the protection of those laws. So, for example, if somebody was eligible for spousal benefits under a Social Security program, they couldn't get any of it. If there was a married same-sex couple that would have had been in a protective tax status, they couldn't access any of those benefits. There were employee benefits, there's survivor benefits, veterans benefits, immigration benefits. I mean, literally over 1,000 laws. So what this decision means is that if you're married in Massachusetts, you get all of the benefits, protections, and responsibilities under federal law. It's a little more complicated if you live in a state that does not allow you to get married. So many couples have come to Massachusetts, either lived here and married or came here to get married, and then moved back to a state which does not allow same-sex couples to marry. For those couples, this decision is a little more complicated. The federal laws turn on 3 different rules, basically, in determining which married couples get the protection of those laws. Some of the laws look to whether or not the marriage is valid where the couple lives. So if it's those kinds of laws, someone who lives in a state like North Carolina, which doesn't allow same-sex couples to marry, won't receive those federal benefits. There are other programs where the rule turns on whether or not the marriage was valid where it was celebrated, like immigration laws, for example, military laws, federal employee benefits laws. Those couples will receive those federal benefits. And there's a third rule, which isn't necessarily worth going into the detail, but the answer is we have yet to see how it will completely play out, and there's more work to do to ensure equality for all couples.
Speaking of more work, we've seen this evolve immensely over the last few years. How much further do you see this going in the next couple of years? You know, do you think we'll see some radical changes here, or what do you think realistically we can expect to see?
Sure. There's, at this point, there's 13 states plus the District of Columbia where same-sex couples can marry. I think there will be significant efforts to increase the number of states where couples can marry. There was a poll that was released after these 2 decisions that showed the highest level of support nationally for allowing same-sex couples to marry. I think it was 55% in that USA Today news poll. Those numbers are just going to increase. And the reason they're going to increase is because what we found in Massachusetts is that there were people who opposed marriage equality because they thought it would lead to some significant shift in society. That hasn't happened. The only people whose lives have been impacted are those who are now protected and whose relationships are strengthened by the laws. And so I think as people throughout the country see that there's no negative consequences to allowing couples to marry and very significant positive protections for people, for families, and for children, that we'll see a growing number of places where same-sex couples can marry.
Now, how quickly are we going to see these changes take effect? Is this something that's immediate, over time? How does this work when you have a Supreme Court ruling like this?
Sure. Well, there's lots of work that's continuing to go on throughout the country. The federal government has said that it's moving very swiftly to figure out and sort through how all these laws are going to apply in individual people's lives. There are already cases moving on across the country challenging some of the state bans on marriages. I think we will see people working to challenge the prohibitions against, people marrying in particular states. And so that's happening right now. I can't predict the number of years really and the pace at which it's going to change, but I think it's fair to say at this point things are only moving in one direction, and that's towards equality.
And for something, as controversial as this, is it possible to challenge the actual ruling? I mean, can you do something like that, or would it have to be a whole new topic? How would something like that work out?
Challenge
the actual ruling.
Ruling?
There's no
this is final. This is final. Yeah. It is absolutely clear from the opinion that the federal government cannot carve out one category of married couples for discrimination. But I think at the same time, what we'll possibly see is, some efforts to ensure that federal law uniformly looks at, same-sex couples marriages just as it does different sex couples marriages, and find more ways to extend those federal protections to married couples.
What is your response to those who have concerns about children in this argument? That's something we also saw brought up in that piece. What would your response to that be?
Yeah, I think that this is a tremendously important ruling for the message that it sends to children, all children, but especially children of same-sex couples, which is to say your families are important, they matter, they are the equivalent of families that are headed by different sex couples. And certainly Massachusetts is one of a number of states that allows same-sex couples to do what's called second parent adoptions, to create legal relationships between children and, say, the two women who have and raised them or the two men who have and raised them. Not every state has those kinds of protections. Marriage oftentimes has been an important way of securing the strength of families, especially for children. So I think this sends a message to children that all families matter.
Okay. Massachusetts has, of course, spearheaded a lot of this. Where do you think we are going in this state? I guess what's next in this effort? Maybe for you personally, with your work, or do you know of any happenings here in Massachusetts that we can expect to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more work to do to spread that message of equality through all levels of not just government, but society and throughout the Commonwealth. Unfortunately, we still see openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender young people facing harassment in schools. I think that, in schools, notwithstanding the positive laws there, young kids use anti-gay language generally to demean people. We've got to address that kind of harassment, that kind of violence. There's been a lot of effort and growing understanding of transgender young people's needs and concerns. And, it was just at the end of just last year that the state passed a law that protects transgender people in employment against hate crimes in schools, et cetera. There's more work to do on that front. So.
And you are a professor at Western New England.
Yep.
What are you hearing from your students? After this type of ruling, I'm sure that there was a discussion. Sometimes they have even more insight that we don't even think. So what are the conversations that students are having right now?
I think they're hopeful, and I think they're excited. I think, as I said, you can never guess before the fact what the outcome is going to be. I think people were really concerned about the ways in which this court is moving. You had Justice Roberts certainly dissenting along with Justice Scalia and others. And so, people were concerned that that might have commanded a majority, which it didn't. So I think that what, students are thinking is that there's hope and forward-looking thinking, including within this court. And yet, as I know you're going to talk about later in the program, there were some very significant losses, particularly in the race context around the Voting Rights Act case and affirmative action. And so I think, students and future lawyers are thinking about the direction of equality and how to ensure broad equality for all. As the court is having a greater understanding in the area for gay people, but wanting to make sure that that spreads across the areas of concern.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer Levi. I want to thank you so much for joining us, offering some insight, helping us understand this ruling. Thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And after the break, we are going to talk about how the ruling impacts tax laws. So stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court's recent rulings on two civil rights issues, gay marriage and voting rights. We have been talking about the Defense of Marriage Act decision and how it will affect same-sex married couples. So joining me now we have Andy Pignatare of the accounting firm Pignatare & Sagan. I want to thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So talk to us what this means from the grand scheme of things, because this has a lot to do with federal benefits. So from a tax perspective, let's start there. As far as filing your taxes is concerned.
For filing your taxes, at this point in time, right now, it looks like we can file an amended return for the federal because already we're recognized in Massachusetts. So for 2012, back years we should wait and hold off at this point, but definitely for 2012, you should talk with your tax consultant and possibly look if married filing jointly will be better than the two people filing single.
So do you know of people already doing that? Is that something that many states are doing, actually going back and doing this retroactive, so to speak?
It's just coming out. I think some, from a legal point of view, some of this has been pushed. From an accounting point of view, we're just starting to see that situation come about now for 2012.
Right, and as far as doing it retroactive several years or anything, that sounds like it might.
I think, Laura, it might be an accounting nightmare, but I think it's going to happen for at least two more years going back. And maybe states like Massachusetts, who first adopted this in 2004, there might be some exploration on a federal or state level of looking beyond that. I don't think so, but it could be considered.
Okay, so talk to me about how this works in states where gay marriage is legal and states where it is not, and now how this works.
Right now we have 13 states that recognize the marriage. I think many more will follow over the next few years, a few more in the next year. But now for Massachusetts and Connecticut, nearby states, both recognizing same-sex marriages, you'll be able to file federally married filing jointly or married filing separately, okay, on that level. So for all the states that allow marriage, you'll definitely be able to do that now and in the future. Married filing separately also. Now on the other states that at the moment, the federal government, if the states don't recognize same-sex marriages, you cannot file a federal return jointly on the states that don't. That may change. We don't know. We don't know what's coming out next. There's still a lot to come out. Federal might say down the road for those states, hey, we don't care about you. From a federal point of view, we could file jointly. Now that would be opposite of what we've been going through in Mass, filing single on federal, joint on state. The other way, it would be the other way around, filing joint on federal. We don't know yet, but that could come.
Sounds like we could see some changes in some of these states, as you were saying. Maybe not all of them, but maybe a few. Now, how does this ruling affect for a surviving spouse, you know, in that sort of situation?
From the state point of view? Okay, from the state point of view, of course, the Windsor case was huge. Now, in that case, some states piggyback the federal on the state tax returns and income tax returns. On the estate tax returns, New York is one of them. And of course, Miss Windsor had a relationship 45 years. She was married in Canada 2007, New York, then recognized the marriage. And when her spouse died in 2009, she went ahead and, as the executor, filed the returns, and she had to pay $100,000 in federal taxes. What happens now, because of the marital exclusion and deduction, she will get the $275,000 that she had to pay. She'll get a $275,000 refund, New York, $363,000 federal, and $100,000 she had to pay in as the executor of estate. So there's going to be a lot of big estate considerations in the states that have same-sex marriages now in the last 3 years.
And how about Social Security?
Social Security is huge. It's going to be, again, now the Social Security Administration, as of June 28th, stated give us 60 days because there's so much paperwork to go through. But what's going to happen is going to be the same as heterosexual couples. For instance, if you have a big wage earner and a small wage earner, well, when they both retire, that small wage earner, if their Social Security isn't half of the larger wage earner, they'll get half. And if their higher income spouse passes away, they will now get stepped up to the higher income spouse Social Security.
Okay.
So that's a definite win.
Yeah. And what about tax credits? Does this affect any tax credits?
Yes, it will affect tax. Right now, I think the big thing, the adoption credit.
Right.
For a federal couple, I mean, the 13 states that accept it plus DC, I think they could go back, and if they adopted, I'm guessing if they adopted a child, legal adoption in the last 3 years recognized by the state, that they'll be able to go back and look at that federal, and that could be some huge tax credits.
Do you think that we'll see additional tax credits, or is that really the big one right now? That seems like the big one right now.
I think the education credits for children, you know, of course, again, in the states that recognize it, you'll have married filing separately, married filing jointly. All the tax credits that go with the heterosexual marriages should pass to the same-sex couples.
So what should people be doing now to prepare? Now, you were talking earlier about amending 2012.
You should definitely, Laura, again, taxes are very confusing to a lot of people unless you're a tax professional. And this applies to same-sex couples and heterosexual couples. You get married for some reasons, love, financial. It's going to be a big decision there because say you have a high income earning couple, whether they're same-sex or heterosexual, if they're both making $300,000-400,000 a year apiece, if it's a financial consideration, whether it's same or heterosexual, if it's a financial consideration, you want to definitely sit down and talk with your tax consultant, because the marriage penalty, you might pay more taxes filing jointly. So some may want to stay single. Others may say, no, it's a matter of principle, for both parties. And they will get married based on principle and pay that tax. For the regular couples that, say, make an average income, definitely married filing jointly will probably work better.
What are some other positive, negative implications that we, may not be thinking about right now that you may have thought of when it comes to tax and financial?
Well, again, now this has nothing to do with, it just has to do with tax laws. Every time you make changes, I feel we should be creating more private jobs than government jobs, because the private sector has to fund the government jobs and fund, it's better when we have less government and more private concerns. And what's happening is the cost factor. If we have to hire more federal employees, do we look at that with all the problems the IRS is going through now, especially with that $70 million in IRS bonuses that just happened 3 weeks ago? Do we really want to go there, or do we want to try to get a more equitable method of taxation on each individual, whether they're single or married, where we don't have to go through all this on a federal and state level, and just try to get a fairer system of taxation? Maybe we should look at simplifying this right now, because it gets very costly from a tax point of view.
Okay, and very quickly, just how people should be preparing for their 2013 as well. Is there anything different than they need to be doing to prepare for this now?
Absolutely. Right now, it's a great time to go sit down with your tax professional.
And maybe figure out what's best.
Try to look at, okay, do I go back to amend 2012? What should I look at 2013? Should I be getting, what would be the financial considerations? It's always good to know your financial considerations too. Of course, love is the most important thing.
Sure,
but,
of course.
But you definitely should sit down and know all the angles. And also, not only income tax, if you have over $1 million in assets in Massachusetts, from the state tax point of view, get somebody that knows something about estate taxes, state attorney, a CPA that knows the state taxes. It's important.
Good to sit down and have that conversation so you are well prepared when tax season comes around, because we all know it can be a very busy time. Andy Pignatare, thank you so much. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And we are going to finish this conversation about gay marriage after this. Then later we are going to discuss the court's ruling that affects the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So stay with us. We have a lot more coming up. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about changes that could be in store following two major rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court. We just heard from an accountant about how gay marriage rulings will impact federal benefits. Joining me now for some more local reaction to hear what's next from a local standpoint, we have Ahmad Rivera, a former Springfield City Councilor, and we have the president and founder of Springfield Pride, and a gay rights organization. And we have Michael Aleo, a civil rights attorney with Lesser, Newman, and Nassar. Thank you both so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So let's start off from a local standpoint. Ahmad, you of course always took a leadership role when it comes to this issue. First openly gay city councilor in Springfield. I first just want to ask you, personally, what this ruling was like for you.
I think words really can't describe the idea that your federal government truly recognizes your love as fully equal. I think this is a monument, not only personally, but from friends and families and neighbors. All the folks who support LGBT rights around the country now know that they can not go to our wedding and it just be something that's a political point, but that we can actually just have a normal wedding that's acknowledged by our government, and we get the benefits that are associated with that. While I'm single, I still want the option and the idea that the option now is one that's ripe with full equality is just a beautiful sentiment, and not many people are able to see history in making. And so I love that Massachusetts I was here in 2004 and fought for marriage equality in the state, and I'm glad that I'm here in 2013 where the federal government acknowledges marriage. So it's a beautiful story that's just beginning and not over.
You know, it really is ever changing, that's for sure, and this has changed a lot over the last couple of years in particular, I feel. And Michael, I mean, this is something that you also have worked closely with as well. Talk to us about, you know, did you see this happening from the legal standpoint, from the government standpoint, and how do you see us evolving from this point forward, you know?
Sure, I did see it happening, but the conversation I would have with my like-minded colleagues was, in our lifetime, we will see this. And it became more and more apparent that it wouldn't just be in our lifetime. You know, it's not over yet, but it'll be within years throughout the country. Same-sex couples will be allowed to marry, which is huge. It's something that 10 years ago was almost unimaginable. Massachusetts led the way, and at this point, it's really upon us. And Justice Scalia laid it out in his dissent. His dissent was very, very clear that based on the majorities, albeit confusing, though monumental decision, there's no way that same-sex marriage is going to survive around the country, and that's just wonderful. It's a big deal. Now, we haven't gotten there. There are still couples around the country who cannot marry. However, we're going to get there. But once we get there, the fight's not over. I practice a lot of employment law, and in Massachusetts, like many states, it's illegal to discriminate in the context of employment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. However, in many states, that's not the case. In the same way that you can marry somebody of the same sex in Massachusetts, but not in certain other states. In Massachusetts, if you're gay, your employer can't fire you because you're gay. They can't deny you a pay raise because you're gay. But in other states, that's not the case. So the next big frontier that really strikes to the heart of people's lives, their income, their ability to put food on the table, to pay rent, is going to be eradicating discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace. That will be the next frontier. Debate has already begun in both chambers, in the House and in the Senate, but it will get hot. You know, people are going to see that same-sex couples, as well as individuals who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, have a right to equal pay in the workplace and to equal terms and conditions of work. And that will be upon us very soon and may accelerate with this decision faster than we'd anticipated.
What do you think are the main points in that argument that, you know, that could slow that down? You know, it sounds, you know, it's obviously going to be an equally controversial topic to talk about, but what do you think are the main points that are going to be involved in that?
The main point, as Justice Kennedy said, there's no legitimate basis to deny same-sex couples the right to marry. Well, it's at least as true, and arguably even more true, that in the context of earning an income, there's no rational reason to deny somebody the right to the benefits of employment solely based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. There's just nothing that you can come up with. I think the counter-argument to that comes down to bigotry and discomfort with people who identify that way. And unfortunately, the arguments totally overlap. However, whereas the Supreme Court, via 5 justices, can say it's illegal to prevent same-sex couples from marrying in the future, the Supreme Court can't do the same via a single decree as easily with regard to employment relations. The Constitution protects against governmental action. So it's governments that have been preventing same-sex couples from getting married. The Supreme Court, the Constitution does not protect against private actors. Generally, not always, but generally, people are employed by private actors. I'm employed by a private actor. So the Supreme Court can't just step in. Congress has to do that. So there will be a large fight, and hopefully things will be looking up, particularly.
Yeah, what do you think was the major tipping point in this ruling? You know, from maybe the government standpoint, or because of course, after, as Jennifer mentioned earlier in the program, the poll that came out that showed about 55% of Americans now in favor of gay marriage, still leaves for a big room of those who are not, those who firmly believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman. So, what do you think was the tipping point in that chamber? You know, what do you think helped, of all the movements and of all the events that have happened? How did this happen?
I really think that last year was a defining moment. Last year, particularly the presidential election, we had the first sitting president of the United States come out in favor of equal marriage. You also saw last year, the first time that we won by ballot in multiple states, approval of same-sex marriages that we saw. So last year was one of the pinnacle movements for the LGBT community in just approval in general. We rarely are seeing our straight or heterosexual counterparts acknowledging and supporting through ballot support of equal marriage, and we saw a lot of that not only through our highest seat in the office of President of the United States, but we saw that in several states. And this is on the coattails of this movement where we're shifting, where folks are, one, the LGBT community is much more out and much more visible and no longer rendered to nightclubs and parties or being pushed to be out closeted at work. You're seeing a whole slew of elected officials, celebrities, influential actors in the United States who are very out and proud. But we're also seeing families, friends, coworkers who are coming out as allies. And we're seeing that all across the country, where people who may not be LGBT, but know, love, care, or respect the LGBT community, they're coming out in droves. And we're seeing that at a new level in ways that we have never seen before. And I think that is the most beautiful thing, is that when the LGBT community and their allies can work together on securing rights, not only for married couples, not only for employment, we're looking for protections of LGBT youth who are disproportionately in higher rates of homelessness, who are at higher rates of bullying and suicide. We're seeing the LGBT community discriminated against in housing. We're seeing all these things happen, but we are seeing a huge uptake in allies stepping up to the plate and saying, we will not tolerate discrimination of any of our brothers and sisters, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And that's something that's very new, and I'm very excited about that happening.
There are a number of challenges, that, as you just said, that we certainly will still overcome. And what would you say to those who will say that there is going to be a spike in marriages, based on financials, or based on, false marriages, so to speak, Of course, we see that now. And but what would you say to those people who, what if we sort of lose that marriage is about love in general? You know what I mean? What would you say to that?
I would say that the marriage equality fight is only about love. And I think there are trials and tribulations associated with marriage that I don't think that this fight was about. And so people will have all kinds of interesting idiosyncrasies about their marriage. And I don't think that we were looking for that particular fight. What we were looking for is that before the law, the LGBT community was not being treated equitably. And so we could not get basic things like a joint tax return on the mortgage interest deduction, or being able to legally adopt children without extra legal hurdles. This was about two people being able to acknowledge their love, some of which have been together for decades. And all people wanted was to make sure that love was acknowledged and respected before the law. And that they also wanted to make sure that their taxes, that often lead to all these tax breaks, were being treated and used equitably. And while we still don't have marriage equality across the United States, we have them in 13 states in the District of Columbia. This is one step, or the first major step, in ensuring that happens. And I can't imagine that anyone can't love. And I think that what a beautiful start to an amazing chapter of equality is that we won in love. And I think that is the start and the beginning of this movement.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end this segment. Thank you so much. We are going to keep you both here, and we're going to continue our conversations, but we are going to talk about the ruling on voters' rights. So stay with us. We're going to talk about that after this. So stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about two major U.S. Supreme Court rulings. We've spent the last half hour focusing on a ruling pertaining to gay marriage. Now we're going to talk about a ruling some say is a major setback when it comes to voting rights. Here's NBC's Pete Williams.
The ruling deals a crippling and potentially fatal blow to the law signed by President Johnson in 1965, a response to widespread efforts in the South to prevent blacks from voting.
We're marching today to dramatize to the nation.
Civil rights veteran John Lewis, now a Georgia congressman, watched as the law was signed.
Without the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there would be no Barack Obama as President of the United States of America. We've come too far, made too much progress to go back.
This decision represents a serious setback for voting rights and has the potential to negatively affect millions of Americans across the country.
In a 5-4 ruling, the court's conservatives said the areas covered by the Voting Rights Act have changed, but the law has not kept up. The act requires states with a history of voter discrimination to get permission from the federal government before changing how they conduct elections. The court left that part intact, but it struck down the map, the coverage formula of where that requirement applies. That's all of 9 mostly southern states and parts of 6 others. Chief Justice John Roberts said the map is based on decades-old data and eradicated practices. In 5 of the covered southern states, he said, African Americans have a higher voter turnout percentage than whites. Opponents of the law who helped Shelby County, Alabama, challenge it, hailed the ruling.
We've just elected a black president of the Shelby County Board of Education over a white incumbent in a countywide election.
African Americans are an integral part of Southern political life, and that's a good thing, and that's never going to change.
But writing for the court's 4 dissenters, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said gutting the law that has helped end voter discrimination is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Civil rights groups vowed to rally the same kind of action from Congress they got 48 years ago.
The reality is the only way Congress will act is if we call, if we march, if we pressure, if we make clear that we do not intend to go backwards on voting.
One state, Texas, responded immediately, saying it would start enforcing one of the nation's strictest voter ID laws, something the federal government tried to stop. And it may also redraw its congressional and legislative districts now that it's no longer covered by the key part of the Voting Rights Act.
And that was NBC's Pete Williams reporting. Joining us now with reaction to this, we once again have Ahmad Rivera, former Springfield City Councilor and president and founder of Springfield Pride, a gay rights organization. And we have Michael Leo, a civil rights attorney with Lesser Newman and Nassar. Thank you both again so much for being here. So talk to me about what this actually means. There's a lot of questions. Is this going to affect us here in Western Massachusetts, the whole country, just the southern states? There's some talk about how this is really going to impact our country. So what do you say?
It will impact everyone. The actual decision applies to mostly southern states, not exclusively southern states, but mostly southern states who since 1965 and a few states since have been monitored by the federal government due to their very poor voting rights record with regard to minorities. So this decision allows southern states to escape that monitoring, essentially, with some caveats. So the majority's decision says those states that had been monitored no longer need to be monitored because the facts have changed. We're no longer in 1965. We no longer have poll taxes and literacy tests, et cetera, that were clearly designed to prevent minorities from voting. And voila, all of a sudden now we have lots of minorities voting in those states. So different times, different circumstances. Of course, the majority acknowledges that the reason, in large part, that we have significantly higher minority voter registration and voting is because of the act itself. It's an argument that feeds on itself. The dissent pointed that out, and the dissent pointed out, Justice Ginsburg writing, the dissent pointed out that today in the South, we have immense issues with voting for minority voters. And we don't have speculation that we do. We have documented evidence. I think it was 15,000 pages in evidence was put into evidence when Congress, the Senate and the House, which we know is not easy for the two houses to actually make legislation. It just doesn't happen. And then for a Republican president, George Bush, to sign off on it, it's not easy to do. Nonetheless, the Senate and the House reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006. In so doing, they accumulated this vast record that really documented the continuing racism in the states that are covered by this federal monitoring. And they did a great job of documenting it. One of the things that they referred to in the dissent was that in Alabama, which is where this county, Shelby County from Alabama, comes, the origins of this particular lawsuit. In Alabama, federal officials, FBI agents, went undercover to actually hear what state legislators had to say in Alabama. And they caught them, of course, saying things that they don't typically say out in public, which were very racially charged comments that clearly were directed at preventing certain legislation from passing, which would make it easier for minorities to vote. So these are real issues that happen today. In fact, publicly during the 2012 presidential cycle, Republican officials in Florida and South Carolina and Ohio, Florida and Ohio being really pivotal swing states, came out and outwardly said the voter measures that we want to adopt will help to elect people like Mitt Romney. In fact, will help to elect Mitt Romney in particular, because they prevent minority voters from going to the polls. Very overt statements that make it clear that this isn't an issue of the past. The Voting Rights Act, perhaps to its detriment to some degree, has been very successful. Without the Voting Rights Act, these states that have been monitored will no longer will no longer be monitored. That affects voters in those states, but it affects the country at large, because who those voters elect as their senators and as their representatives greatly impact what happens around the country. So it'll impact voters in those countries. It won't impact voters, voters in those states.
Right. What about here in Massachusetts?
It won't impact people in Massachusetts.
Right.
And even in voters in states in the South, those voters can still sue for violations of the Voting Rights Act. It's still illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. However, it's so much more difficult to sue than it is to go through these monitoring procedures that they had previously been able to go through. In other words, the federal government, this past election cycle, stopped certain laws from being put in the books in certain states that were clearly designed to aid Mitt Romney in getting elected by suppressing minority votes. So it's easy to go through those procedural steps with these provisions that have now been struck down. Really only one provision was struck down, but with that provision struck down, now there's nothing there. Now you sue, and suing takes forever. You know, as an attorney, I can tell you, suing takes a long time.
Suing takes a very long time. You know what? We're going to stop here. We are going to continue this conversation after the break. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll pick up where we left off. So stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. We are continuing our conversation now with Ahmad Rivera, founder of Springfield Pride, and Michael Alio, a civil rights attorney with Lester Newman and Nassar. Thank you again for being here. So we were just talking about the Supreme Court's decision, the voter rights. What do we do from this point forward? Obviously, this was pretty surprising to see. Maybe it wasn't surprising, but you know, what do we do from this point forward? What changes, updates do we have to have happen to, you know, bring things back to where they should be?
I think, well, one, I'd just like to say that I think while the equal marriage and Prop 8 decisions were absolutely amazing, that that week of decisions were actually really tough. We saw the narrowing of affirmative action, we saw the restrictions of workplace discrimination and bullying, and then we saw the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. So in general, while we've seen amazing movement forward, we also saw a step back. And what the VRA decision really did is it punted a larger conversation about protections of communities of color throughout the United States, particularly in the South, to Congress. And it asked Congress that you have to update this formula to reflect 21st century issues. And as many of us know, we've seen just in the last two presidential elections, huge contested, and actually more than that, contested elections where we saw long lines at the polls. The attempt and implementation of voter IDs, which we've seen even a push in Massachusetts for, particularly in the Southbridge special election. We saw huge billboards where there were folks pushing for voter IDs. We saw huge lines in Florida. And so we know that voting is still something where many barriers exist, even in amazing places like Massachusetts, all throughout the state, but in particular in the South, where there are huge populations of people. And so now it is a rallying cry of elected officials, particularly on the congressional level, to say, are we going to stand and create and protect the right to vote in the 21st century in a way that allows, regardless of who you are and where you come from, the right to vote and pick the candidates of your choice. As a person of color, as an LGBT person, we see the South in particular having some of the most stringent anti-LGBT policies in the country. We're also seeing huge policies that are impacting communities of color, where they're looking for example, citizenship IDs and information just to vote, or even turn on your water, where people of color often don't have IDs due to financial circumstances. So in the South, we, as a person of color, as LGBT folks, we're seeing a way in which these things are coming together in a very dangerous way, and it leaves Congress, which doesn't have the best reputation at the moment, to figure out a way to solve this, not only in the South, but across the country. So I think it's a rallying point for all of us to get more involved, to really push our elected leaders to make a decision on how they're going to have this conversation about 21st century voting rights.
Mm-hmm. And in Springfield, there's something similar. Can you talk to us about that as well?
So what's really amazing is that I got into the council as part of the ward-based representation system, which many advocates in the community used various forms of Voting Rights Act to talk about the limitations that, as a city that's majority people of color, they had only seen one elected Latino leader and very few African American leaders ever elected in the history. We have never actually had a mayor of color, for example, despite being a majority people of color city. And so several years ago, there was a suit to attempt to change the system, because at-large systems, the argument was, do not reflect or allow for the term typically minority representation. They often were all elected from the same physical location and all often have the same demographic information. And so while ultimately that case was lost, we through a legislative process then brought ward-based representation to the table. And now you're seeing the most diverse city council in history of Springfield, where we have the first Latina ever elected, for example, and more women on the council than we've had in the past. And so we can see the implications of coming up with a 21st century voting rights agenda happening right here in Springfield in Western Massachusetts. Just as a fact, the Springfield MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area, is the #1 most segregated between Latinos and whites in the United States. And so there is room for a 21st century agenda on voting rights and other things to ensure that we are getting representation from communities of color. And so it's a local issue as well as a national issue.
It is. So it's important that people now take their views and get in touch with Congress, right? I mean, what can people do now to make change, to get this moving forward?
The Supreme Court did in fact punt it over to the Congress, so get on the phone and urge your Congress people to bring forward legislation that really protects voting rights.
All right, very good. Ahmad Rivera and Michael Alio, I want to thank you both so much for being here, offering some insight, talking to us about these two very controversial issues. I think we covered it. So thank you so much. I want to thank you both so much for being here. And we are going to have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we discussed two major U.S. Supreme Court decisions. During the first half hour of our program, we talked about changes that affect gay marriages. And in the second part, we talked about a ruling that affects voting rights. We also talked to an accountant about some of the specific changes that could take effect. That is our program for today. If you've missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website at WWLP.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday. Take care, everyone.